much, Ruba, for the introduction, and thank you to the previous speaker. It's an honor to be on the panel, especially with people that I've read from and I'm learning from. So I feel honored to be part of the panel. Before I start, I would like to express my sympathies and condolences to the people of Sudan for all the suffering that you are going through, for all the fears and horrors that you are living on a daily basis. For this panel, I chose to shed light on the financial and business networks and the regional sponsors behind the war. So picking up actually on Mr. Hogendorn's last point, maybe. I won't go into the history really. Of course, there is a whole history of Sudan's predatory production systems, which since long before independence have relied on the use and threat of violence, and which are one of the main drivers behind the ongoing militarization of the economy. But speaking more of the recent past, we see that in the last 2-3 decades, both armies, RSF and Sudanese armed forces, have amassed vast amounts of wealth, and that they control really sophisticated networks of companies that are estimated to make up 80% of economic activity in Sudan. On the one side, we have SAF that controls the economy in a much more institutionalized manner than the RSF. Most of it runs through its economic arm, the military-industrial complex, as well as other ostensibly charity organizations. These organizations and institutions are led by SAF leaders and their cronies, and they control companies, including seemingly private companies. The companies are not limited to the security or the defense sector, but straddle a whole range of sectors such as agriculture, banking, mining, transport, construction, private security. And it's difficult to estimate the exact size, but estimates say that the military industrial complex alone controls over 200 companies with an annual revenue of $2 billion. It is estimated by the former transitional government of Dr. Hamdok that 80% of these companies are operating outside of any form of accountability, public accountability. And that was something the transitional government was pushing for. Now, on the other side, we have the RSF with its business networks that are more recently developed, but have come to compete with the businesses of the Sudanese armed forces. These businesses are really part of a family empire around a Dagalo family with Hamiti at the very center. They started off their business in Darfur as a militia, as you know, and gold played an important role. In 2017, they took over one of the key mines there, Jebel Amir, which is estimated to generate or to have generated around that time 54 million per year for the militia group that controlled it. The figures might have changed, but it's just to give an indication of the wealth. In Darfur, then the RSF controlled migration routes, different ones, and they made money by running these routes, but also by ostensibly curbing migration flows, including as part of European-funded efforts. And then thirdly, their soldiers fought in, as did the soldiers of SAF, by the way, but they fought in Libya and Yemen and were rewarded for their efforts. And all this money was then reinvested into other sectors, more legit sectors, such as transport, construction, agriculture, livestock, very important, real estate, also banking. So we see the sectors overlap. They're enabling sectors for any business activity. ICT is a very important one for the RSF. Maybe just to give an indication, when Hamiti at one point in 2019 dared to display all his wealth, is when he deposited $1 billion into the central bank, which was paid for, or was meant to be paid for, to be paying for teachers and police. This money came from the rewards of his troops fighting in Yemen. Now, what is interesting about these networks is that they're extremely flexible and adaptive, which makes it difficult to target them. They are, as you know, maybe a good example is the publication we saw last summer by C4ADS, a nonprofit organization in the US that published in Arabic and English a sizable share of these businesses. And immediately after that publication, we saw a lot of new names of companies emerge, new front companies also appear, and different layers of intermediary businesses, in particular for those linked to the RSF. The second point I'd like to make is that there is a regional dimension to those networks, and both have very strong ties to regional sponsors. For SAF, this is mainly Egypt. SAF has, of course, strong ties with the Egyptian armed forces. And based on that military cooperation, there's also a strong cooperation at business level through individual businesses that have cooperation, but also more broadly through the military industrial complex. The cooperation on the economic side has a formal aspect and an informal aspect to it. So, for instance, there are several companies such as Multiple Directions, Green Zone, that have ties with the Egyptian intelligence or the military, which are not overt corporations, but they've been tracked down very clearly. On the other hand, from the RSF side, we see that the ties are strongest with the UAE. Some of their front companies belong to the RSF network. They're based in the UAE. And the RSF itself has a bank account in its own name at the First Abu Dhabi Bank. Most importantly for the UAE support is that the main destination for export, both legal and illegal, of Sudan's gold are the Emiratis, and a large part of that gold is owned by the Dagalo family. There is different businesses in gold that then have relations with, for instance, European companies, which I will come back to in a second. So with the war raging and a lot of infrastructure, factories and banks, not just being destroyed, but actually being targeted. We saw Omdurman Bank, which belongs to SAF, being looted last week. It's clear that domestic income streams will no longer provide resources to finance the war, or it will be increasingly difficult to mobilize these resources locally. So it is very likely that generals are going to rely increasingly on their regional sponsors. And that means mainly for South Egypt and for the RSF, the Emiratis. So what can be done to prevent that from happening if, the urgent question here is how to stop that war and remain in scenario one as just outlined? There needs to be a stronger push for the application of targeted sanctions on business networks, and especially on their foreign branches that are more vulnerable to outside pressure. These sanctions should be targeted on companies that are benefiting mainly the generals and not the population. So I'm talking about the gold mining here, real estate, but also private security provisions. More caution obviously should be applied when dealing with companies active also in agriculture and banking, which are likely to impact the Sudanese population at large. The direct impact of the sanctions might be limited, but these measures will still create reputational damage for the networks and companies, and especially for their foreign business partners. Secondly, I think it's crucial to pressure Egypt and the UAE, at least from the Western side. I think the leverage of the West is fairly limited on the generals right now, but there is possibilities to pressure their sponsors, Egypt and UAE, to roll back their support to the generals. Not just the direct support, but also the enabling of the general businesses in their own countries. In the case of Egypt, the US obviously has significant leverage given the military aid given each year, but there is broader leverage, including the EU, with regard to institutions such as the IMF, with which the bankrupt Egyptian government is negotiating a new support package at the moment. On the other hand, in the UAE is very keen on being delisted from the Financial Action Task Force grey list. So public pressure campaigns shedding light on the UAE's role in the illicit trade in Sudanese gold may result in, private diplomatic efforts being more successful. Final point, this pressure would need to be coordinated. It's clear that no foreign actor will stop helping their Sudanese counterpart if the other side doesn't do the same. And Saudi Arabia can play an important role here to coordinate this effort and make sure that the pressure is put on both sides, Egypt and the UAE. These are pragmatic points, entry points to put pressure. I'm not saying that this is the only solution. I think the role of the civilians is key and should not be ignored, as it was largely during the political process that led us to this crisis. But so far, I think this is one entry point that hasn't been fully applied. And it is absolutely urgent that Sudan moves up on the priority list of many, if not most, Western countries. And the current events show that this lack of attention is a huge mistake. The lives of 46 million Sudanese are exposed to a brutal, senseless war. And so every effort is needed to stop that.